to start now, so I'm going to kick off proceedings and welcome you all. Thank you very much for coming along to this really important meeting on Brexit and Muslims. It should be a very interesting discussion, I'm sure. My name is Shazia. I'm a political campaigner and a human rights campaigner, and I will be the chair for this evening. Before we start, I just want to let you know where fire exits are. They're directly behind you. Toilets are just out and to the right, so you should find a relatively easy signpost. So welcome. This meeting is kindly organised and hosted by the Muslim Association of Britain. MAB has been around for about 2 decades, and it was set up in 1997, and it's dedicated to serving society, promoting comprehensive understanding of Islam in all its dimensions. And it's been working with Muslims in the wider community and British society at large to bridge an understanding there. We are very pleased to be joined by a great selection of panellists this evening. We are waiting on one speaker who should be joining us very shortly. The conference is particularly important because we are obviously talking about probably the most important thing to have happened in a political generation, and obviously Brexit will have many consequences for us all. Talking about Brexit from any point of view is always going to be a challenge, but obviously the rise of particular political tensions in Britain after the Brexit vote makes this conference particularly important. I'm going to kick off now, and I'm going to introduce our first speaker, Shanaz Banrawala. Shanaz is the head of research at MEND. You should all have one of these pamphlets, and there's a detailed biography of all of our speakers in there. So Shanaz, I'll hand it over to you.
So I would begin by saying this is a really difficult question to address, Brexit, what next? Because to some extent, what next is a question the country is asking itself with no certain answers. There isn't much that we know at the moment in terms of what Brexit means for the country. We certainly don't know what Brexit negotiations are going to look like. What we do know is that it's going to dominate the Parliament up to 2020, and that the conversations and the dialogues that are going to be taking place both within the country and between the UK and European countries and further afield is going to have a major impact, both in the years intervening and in what will be the post-Brexit years. What I want to start by saying is that Brexit isn't an event, it's a process. It's something that's going to take a long time to get to, and that uncertainty and trepidation is with what I preface the remarks I want to make, because I'm not sure how much of this are things that we can say with certainty. What we do know is that these are certain anxieties that we're feeling at the moment, and these are certain questions that organisations, certainly organisations like mine, are asking themselves in terms of what will be our role throughout this process. I hope everyone can hear me. I want to start with something about the domestic structure around Brexit, because obviously the prevailing Euroscepticism that brought us to this has a huge impact on the landscape that we've now inherited. It has a lot to do with the way that the Conservative Party appreciates itself, the way that it appreciates its role in the world, and in its relationship with what is termed the Anglosphere, the English-speaking peoples. In an imperial age, that would certainly have made sense, but in a post-imperial, it is about reconstructing that role of the UK in the world. We know it from the Brexit campaigning in terms of the cultivation of reformed relationships with the Commonwealth, but the relationships, or the type of relationship that we're talking about, are things that we're not too clear about at the moment. The political landscape that we have is shaped very much with those things that were brought to the fore by Euroscepticism, this notion of the UK having a new relationship with the rest of the world, but more importantly, of parliamentary sovereignty, this notion that the UK Parliament has to reign supreme, both in relation to relationships with European institutions, but more specifically in terms of the jurisdictions of respective courts. The resurgence of nationalism in that context, of this notion of the English-speaking peoples and our relationships with other countries around the world, was preceded by Brexit quite a lot. You think of the Scottish referendum and the questions that were asked then about the West Lothian question, about the role of Scottish MPs sitting in Westminster voting on laws that would invariably impact on English voters, but would have where Scottish MPs would have a parliamentary privilege. So there is a precedence to some of those conflicts in terms of domestic nationalisms. What we find in the post-Brexit period is what this reassertion of Westminster's sovereignty in relation to both those regional assemblies and in relation to its conversation with the rest of the world. What will that look like? I'm specifically interested in the context in relation to British Muslims, mostly because of the work that I do at MEND. The areas of engaging Muslims in political participation, of challenging representations of Islam and Muslims in the public sphere, specifically the media, and in advocating on policy, public policy that has an impact, a disproportionate impact on British Muslims. To that extent, my remarks are going to be largely confined to two things, media and politics. And when I say media, I'm talking largely about public discourse and in relation to politics, public policy. And when I address the question, what next, I'm talking about the process itself, that is what's coming, but also just to touch on how we got here, because I think the significance of how we got here, or at least what we saw in the electioneering, will have tremendous impact on the way in which Muslim communities will adapt and address the circumstances that arise from Brexit. The first comment I would make is in relation to this notion of what's been termed in the media as post-factual politics. And I think it's a really neat term, but it's what it illustrates and what it demonstrates about the way that the campaign was run, but the way that campaigns look to be shaping up for the future that should present particular anxieties. It's not just about the seepage of anti-Muslim discrimination into our election campaigns, because we've been witnessing this for a number of years. You only have to look at the catalogue of far-right candidates, and particularly far-right parties that have disseminated anti-Muslim sentiments on social media, on public platforms, in election leaflets, etc. So this has a history. What I'm talking about in relation to post-factual politics, or at least what we're talking about nationally, is about the quality of our political discourse in the UK when it comes to important political decisions. And I think this is really, really important. When we look at surveys in relation to reasons why people don't want to engage in politics, particularly young people, you will find reasons asserted such as they don't trust politicians, they regard politicians not to be acting in the public interest, that they maybe do not know enough about politics in order to make informed choices. The role of public information is really significant if you think that we're talking about a national conversation that affects all of us. This isn't just about media misrepresentation. The front page of the Daily Express about 12 million Turks turning up on the UK's doorstep if we don't vote for Brexit, or the remarks by Andrea Leadsom on a Sunday political programme about the UK not having a veto on Turkish eventual entry into the European Union. It goes beyond that. It's about the role that the media itself plays in holding institutions and politicians to account. The fact that Brexit, for a large part, was discussed in abstraction. We were talking about things without really understanding the issues that lay behind them. It is the role of the media as the fourth estate to be probing what those questions of Brexit would mean, investigating the extent to which political statements that were being made were truthful, were factual, and critically analysing what it was that the country was being presented with in terms of a choice in the referendum. I preface all of these remarks because I want to talk about four very specific aspects in relation to this notion of how we got here. The first is the question of nationalism. And I speak of it in terms of integration and belonging. We know from surveys that have been done to date that Muslims identify very strongly with a British identity. They are more likely than other ethnic minorities to identify with Britishness as a primary identity, barring Sikhs as a religious community. We also know that Muslims are more likely to have less likely to have a strong minority identification, a much stronger British identification. Survey results also show that white Britons, the white majority, tend to have a stronger affinity to Englishness as an identity, and that holds also for Jewish communities. The connotations of race that are implicated in Englishness are usually what divide minority communities. They regard Englishness as a very racially constructed identity and Britishness as a civic identity, the sense that it's about a construction of national identity that is more inclusive. The question around Brexit or post-Brexit and what next is, with the reassertion of nationalisms, both Scottish and English, what impact will that have on Muslim communities in terms of how they adapt and realign their identities, either in relation to Scottish nationalism, should we see a second Scottish referendum, but also in relation to Britishness, where the construct of Britishness is fractured. We know certainly that Scottish Muslims have that Scottish Muslims are are regarded more favourably among Scottish populations than Muslims are regarded in the population at large. The questions that I'm curious about is, what will this mean for the future? Are we going to see, for example, divergent trajectories in Muslim integration in Britain, where Scottish Muslims take on one trajectory and Muslims living in the English realm take on a different one, and Muslims living in Wales a different one further? I mean, the Muslim populations across England and Wales are quite different. It's 4.8 across the country, but 3.3% of that reside in England, and 1.4% in Scotland and 1.5% in Wales. If you think of a regional distribution, 5% in the country as a whole seems quite significant as a second largest faith community. But when you break it down by region, those proportions become smaller still. What will that mean, for example, for the role of religion in the reshaping of national identity, and what will it mean for Muslims in particular, where national identity is constructed in racial terms, or the connotations of race come to the forefront, and less so in civic terms? The fact that Britain is becoming less of a Christian country, or that there are more people that identify with non-religion than religion, means that all of this will be interesting things to look out for in future, certainly in terms of how Muslims orient themselves in terms of their identity and the way they construct their identities. The question of identity brings me to the second area that I want to address, which is hate crime and xenophobia, and the escalation of incidents that we've seen post-Brexit. And we've seen the way that the government has responded to this by publishing its hate crime action plan. We know that police forces are alert to the fact that much of this is going on, and that local councils certainly have taken the lead in terms of passing motions challenging the rise of hate crime. What I'm more concerned about is that when we talk about uniting the country post-Brexit, and we're talking not just about the 48% who voted to remain, but uniting the country on the basis of those reasons why people chose to leave in the first place. The fact that they felt they have no economic stake in the future, the lack of responsiveness of political institutions to the needs of people who feel disenfranchised or alienated, and particularly the protection of minorities. Many of these issues are issues that Muslim communities have been talking about for a very long time. The policy of disengagement of national government with Muslim community organizations, whether we talk, for example, of the lack of transparency in the way that consultations take place on public policy issues, the exclusion of mainstream Muslim organizations from the process of policymaking, or using state institutions in order to construct community representation. And Therese O'Toole and Tariq Madood present this in a piece of analysis that suggests that the way in which UK government related with Muslims at one stage took on the form of "take me to your leader." Under certain government programs, this has mutated into something that looks more like "this is your leader." And the issue in relation to uniting the country and the way that the government proceeds with this for Muslim communities is, to what extent will that uniting the country actually take on a significance that overcomes this policy of disengagement, where Muslim communities have largely been pushed to the side and marginalised in terms of a dialogue with national government. How will it look like, particularly in relation to the questions that Brexit is going to bring up? The issues that matter in this area specifically are those related to counter-terrorism and security. It is because a large part of the way that Brexit was framed and what the post-Brexit negotiations will focus on will be questions of security. The criticisms that we have of Prevent at home will be criticisms that will reassert themselves, not least because part of the way that security relationships will be negotiated will be contingent on the way in which that security policy will be reframed. I'm out of time, but I just want to touch on one very quick thing, which is the issue of pan-European Muslim alliances. To some extent, the structure of the EU gave Muslims an institutional framework in which to relate to Muslim organisations across Europe. It was the case that the European Parliament, the existence of the European Commission, the institutions within the EU, like the Fundamental Rights Agency, gave Muslim communities orientation in terms of the way that they structured the dialogues that they were having together in order to influence these respective institutions. In the absence of our relationship with the EU, the questions that we'd be looking at, where will that gravitational pull come from, and what kind of pan-European or pan-Muslim alliance, what will they look like? To what extent are we going to see a reformulation of alliances, a transatlantic alliance, for example? Will Muslim communities in the UK have to revive some kind of alliance with Commonwealth countries if Commonwealth countries become more significant to the way that Britain imagines its future in a post-Brexit world?
Thank you so much for that, Shanaz. That was very, very interesting. I did forget to mention that there is a hashtag to join in this conversation. So if you're on Twitter, it's MabBrexitConf, C-O-N-F. And this event is also being live streamed on Facebook. So if you're watching on Facebook, you can join in the conversation via Twitter or via the comment section on Facebook. Our next speaker is Khalil Charles. He is a broadcaster and is currently the head of news at Islam Channel.
Okay. Thanks very much indeed for all of you coming along. As has been explained, I am Khalil Charles. That's not important. But it is important, inshallah, that what we have to discuss today, or what we have to think about today, is going to affect all of our lives. I'd like to begin by thanking the last speaker, which is some very interesting points that were brought up there, and indeed to all the panel, and to Al-hamdoon for inviting me to speak here today. I'm truly, truly humbled by that. Brothers and sisters, ladies and gentlemen, my task tonight, by the grace of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is to help each other understand what the impact, the likely impact is going to be of the decision by the country. I can hold it. Do I put it under my mouth? The decision by, the likely impact decision to leave the European Union. And what that impact is going to have on Muslim communities here in the UK. I use the word communities not as a divisive or a negative thing, but to appreciate there are vast differences within the Muslim community about how they view the world. So by saying communities, it's a recognition of that and an acknowledgement of that difference and the diversity that makes up the Muslim Ummah in this country. I've also chosen to concentrate on something, I think the rest of the speakers will delve into a lot of the other areas, but I've chosen to concentrate on some of the covert ideas that underpin the very negative changes that I think is going to happen for a foreseeable future. Rather than to list the points of how it's going to affect Muslims, I think we have to look at something that's happening here. So I begin by saying that the sun never sets on the British Empire, because I think it's a question here that we need to really examine, because it's easy to say that the Brexit was a vote against uncontrolled immigration. I think it's easy to say that it was a fear of the ordinary British person the ordinary British person, about lifestyles and opportunities for their children in terms of housing and education and jobs. I think that they're all genuine concerns that people have. And of course, there are a plethora of reasons why people decided that we needed to leave the EU. But to my mind, and to some of the Brexit ideas here, it's actually underpinned by an ideology which I think is very pernicious, and it's still alive, and it's projected through the media. So rather than being something which is down up, I think it's more of something that's just top down. And we're seeing its ugly head raised during the debates, prior to that, the mayoral elections, and we've seen that after the June 23rd vote. I'd like to share with you a text message, okay, that came from my younger brother. A text message that happened a couple of days after the result, okay, and this is what he wrote. He wrote, and I have the text message still on my phone today, and when I look at it, it actually, quite touches me. He says that I'm not ashamed to say that I cried on Friday morning. I don't recognise this country anymore. Got my Euros on Thursday. We're off to Spain, him and his wife. Funny enough, next Saturday, might cancel my return ticket. He's still in Spain. Well, that's the decision he made. It's a personal opinion. In the conversation with colleagues, okay, friends and fellow journalists like Dilly Hussain of the Five Pillars website, and I hope you don't mind because I'm going to steal some of his observation, and I was struck by his comments. He said that not every Brexiter is a racist, but every racist voted Brexit. That's his opinion. It may be something which sticks in people's mind. But sadly, the racism and Islamophobia manifested himself in a cycle of hate and a climate of fear that we saw in the aftermath of that decision. Now, let's be very clear. The racist ideology that I'm talking about is not present in every single white person or every single British person in this country, not even in the vast majority of people, and not even the vast majority of non-Muslims. Let me make that quite clear. That it's absolutely ridiculous for anybody to suggest that that's the case, and it's ludicrous for anybody to suggest that that's the case that I'm making tonight. That's definitely not the case. But what I'm saying is that I believe that the ideology has a significant traction in the corridors of power, and therefore the potential to find its way into legislation post-Brexit is very real. I do believe that, and again, Dilly was saying that Brexit was about nationalism versus globalism. Okay, something that just as I mentioned earlier in terms of the way nationalism is perceived. But I also believe it's about repairing the fragile identity of some British people, some English people maybe, as much as it was about leaving Brexit. I think there's an identity question which needs to be examined here. And I think it's fair to say that in life it's never easy to see oneself as being a diminished power, as not having the power you once had. And losing power that you once enjoyed always hurts. So for some, they read history and reflect on the breakdown of the lost empire and their identity is just traumatic, and the effect is that the sense of worth and the sense of Britishness is lost. By the way, please forgive me, because every time I was writing this presentation, the spell check kept giving me Britishness. I put Britishness in, and it kept saying brutishness for some reason. I don't know why that is. But we're here we hear all the time things have changed. But what's new? Things are forever going to be changing. That is life. Okay? That's for some of the answers of people who wrote the Brexit. Oh, life is not the way it was before. But I put it to you that this is a reflection, amongst other factors, of the perception of self, which is a part of a nostalgic link, if you like, to lost empires. And this informs the ideology that ends up spewing hatred, racism, and Islamophobia. Okay? So, the slogan, "Take control back," was the beginning, my view was the beginning of the unspoken jingoistic Donald Trump-like statement to take it back, to make Britain great again. It's just this kind of idea. And in a sense, what does that mean, making Britain great again? I'm choosing these two because these really were the architects of the Brexit campaign. And I was very, very disappointed with the kind of negativity that they were putting forward. And it was this nostalgic kind of nationalism, if you like, that you saw in figures like Boris, who again is a very, very popular MP within the Conservative ranks. And what they have said themselves, I think if we examine what they say themselves, we can examine where we're going with a lot of this Brexit. And don't forget that Allah says that what they hide in their hearts is a lot worse than what they say on their tongues. So writing in a book, Dream of Rome, the former Mayor of London, Boris Johnson, wrote that the idea, it would be good to recapture the enormous public-spirited creative energy of the Romans, to say nothing of the efficiency that allowed them to rule an empire of 80 million with 150 officials. That is essentially the empire. Now, before I'm accused of quoting Mr. Johnson out of context, let's take it what he directly said about brutish. I mean, apologise, what I mean about Britishness, okay? He writes, in the wake of Enoch Powell's racist foray, no one has the guts to talk about Britishness, or whether it's a good thing to insist on the basic loyalty of immigrants to the country of their immigration. Okay, so these are very nuanced ideas, and these are very the newest nuanced things that he said. And just for another one, for good measure, we need to acculturate the second generation Muslim communities to our way of life and to end the obvious alienation they feel. Now I can go into Michael Grove, I won't take that much time up, but I'm not going to interpretate or give an interpretation or analysis. Rather, I'll leave you with, in your own minds, and try and suggest that the dream of the empire remains, and it's a nostalgic one which is peppered with colonial undertones. Now, I can't go into a whole list of racist things that Boris Johnson has said, so I won't even bother to try that. But of course, you know, he called people that look like me pickaninnies with watermelon smiles. Also, that black people had lower IQs and they were multiplying like flies. All this kind of stuff that he said. I'm reminded by Raza Nadeem of Impact, who pointed out that we have seen since Brexit, we felt how racists felt more empowered, if you like, emboldened since the referendum. But the reality is that this racism has been around for a long time. So tell me about it, Raza, you know, since the empire, I guess. So sadly, I don't have time to talk about Gove. We're just going very, very quickly. I'll leave you that because I know we're running out of time. What sort of time we're talking about? Okay. Okay. So the long and the short of what I'm trying to say is that Britishness, for a small percentage, and it is small, but it's a small percentage, were influential and powerful. They want to exclude those who do not like, look, or act British, and those who cannot be acculturated, if you like, into the British values that we've seen and heard so much about in the last year or so, British values. So let's not be under any illusion, okay? Brexit has set the stage for this ideology to flourish and to be enshrined in a new anti-Muslim, anti-immigration narrative with legislation that threatens, in my mind, more than ever before our communities. I don't think we should be in any doubt about that. And I'm sorry, I don't buy the argument that nothing will change very much. We always knew that they had a problem with us before and then that'll continue. No, quite honestly, I think that's just wishful thinking. I believe that Muslims and people of difference will be put under increased pressure and as we approach the new milestone on the road to Brexit. And I feel that every new milestone we get to Brexit, you'll see the kind of reaction that you had on the streets of London, on the streets of the UK. And I believe that next I think that's wrong. The next milestone, if you like, is going to be the triggering of the Article 50. And when Article 50 is triggered, stay at home, perhaps. I'm painting a negative figure, a negative picture, but I really do feel that we have to really take seriously what the threat of the ideas that some have and where the legislation might run to. Because a lot of what I'm saying, and I'm going to have to leave a lot of what I want to say, but a lot of this is underpinned by the notion that Europe, for a long time, it protected us from all those laws that don't need revision. The laws in Europe, etc., about pay and legislation, etc., about racism and anti-discrimination. Now there's a new framework of laws that's going to have to be decided by the British people themselves. And that framework is something that we need to have a full discussion in it, okay? Now, can I have just one more minute to say that I think as part of our Brexit call to action, we need to dig deep into the Quran and Sunnah. I know when I say Quran and Sunnah, people tend to think, oh no. But that is, at the end of the day, the wisdom and the guidance that every single Muslim needs to look at and to take from. And one of the things that I was just reading about Surah Al-Baqarah, which Maulana El-Hamdoon kind of gives a little tafsir on that, and he said that during that time when Muslims were under threat, the Surah Al-Baqarah was a way of asking Muslims to come together and to unite. And I think that's what we need to be doing in this room and outside of this room. And so you can read it yourself of what I think the calls to action should be, and also that they should keep ready and prepared for any menace which might come from any side to suppress and crush the ideology. And oppose it tooth and nail. We have to be opposing the legislation that's coming out. There was some bright stars, if you like, in the last kind of legislation against prevent policy. We have to continue to do that, and we have to continue to work together and closely together. Very lastly, we should have the courage and the conviction to defend Islam, not necessarily defend Muslims necessarily, but always to defend Islam, to speak the truth, to speak straight, justice, kindly, etc., and all those qualities that makes us as Muslims. So today, my talk will finish on that call to action, and I pray, inshallah, that we can see through and we can be part and parcel of the community that we help to build. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. That's me, by the way.